right? I mean, they want to get reelected, and the easiest proven way to get reelected, going back to Roman times, is giving people free bread and free circuses, right? So having a central bank, I mean, forget unemployment, forget GDP, forget CPI, forget all the acronyms. The purpose of having a central bank is to let the government borrow more at cheaper cost than it otherwise could.
Thanks for plugging in to Rethinking the Dollar. I'm excited to have today's guest, Keith Weiner, founder of the Gold Standard Institute, as well as KeithWeinerEconomics.com, sit down with us today to discuss our current monetary system, as well as to give us his thoughts on the use of gold as money. I'm sure you're going to find us to be very informative. Click the subscribe button below for more RTD interviews, as well as monetary news updates. Enjoy this conversation.
Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. Keith Weiner, Economist and Monetary Scientist from the Gold Standard Institute based in Phoenix, Arizona. Today he joins us to discuss our monetary system, as well as give us his thoughts on the dollar. Mr. Weiner founded the Gold Standard Institute in 2012 with the goal of providing an educational organization dedicated to spreading awareness and knowledge of the usage of gold as money. So, Keith, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to sit down with me. I know you're a very busy man, a lot of traveling and things like that. So I'm looking forward to getting your take on what's going on currently now with all this Fed rate hike stuff, as well as give us some more information about precious metals and whatnot. So without further ado, what comes to mind when Keith hears the words rethinking the dollar?
Good question. So the dollar has been through a lot of transitions. It's been death by incrementalism over a couple of hundred years. What I think comes to mind today is that a lot of people are getting increasingly angry because it isn't working for them. And so there's increasingly the need for this discussion that could not have happened before 2008, but the crisis of 2008 and the policy responses of the Federal Reserve post-2008 have made a lot of people say, you know what, time for a reset, time to think, what are we doing here and why?
All right, good point there. Now, how important is it at this particular time, especially for citizens globally, to become aware of monetary history, monetary matters, and just fiscal policy of their government in general? Why is that important now, do you think?
I think it's the most important issue in the world, and so I make the case that the government imposes some kind of crazy tax. I don't know, it costs $3,000 per full-time employee. And businesses are really good at restructuring. It's okay, you're not full-time anymore, you're part-time, you're 29 hours. If they impose some kind of crazy regulation, the people that are impacted the most will figure out a way around it. But when it comes to monetary policy, the perverse incentive of the policy can actually make people want to destroy capital enthusiastically and aggressively and scale up very large-scale enterprises for the purpose of capital destruction, because monetary policy makes it profitable to do so. So this is the most important issue of our era, I think.
Right. Now, just more of an opinion-based question, why do you think this subject matter is or was never really taught in our education system in general?
Well, I mean, the idea of having a purely fiat currency, purely irredeemable currency, is terribly convenient to politicians.
Right.
And so they don't have any interest in educating people in government schools that this is the real nature of the game.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right. Now, you spend a lot of time doing things internationally, business related, of course. And so you get a chance to see various things, and I'm sure you're well in tune to a lot of things happening globally right now. And so if you had the chance to, I guess, be in front of the camera, and all cameras globally was tuned into your station or you directly at the podium, you had to give the global state of the economy address, what all would it entail and why?
I think the theme is of failing currencies, not in the way that most people expected and predicted, which is hyperinflation, but rather we're drowning in a collapsing interest rate. So interest is negative in Switzerland, interest is negative in Germany and Denmark and Finland and other places. It's coming here, notwithstanding the fact that the Fed raised the federal funds rate by 25 basis points yesterday. The trend for 3.5 decades is falling interest. Now, what does that do? First of all, what are you supposed to do if you're saving up for retirement? You're working, you collect a salary, you collect a wage, and you're setting aside money. Well, I'm just old enough to remember when I was young and I was starting out, the standard advice was set aside 10% of your salary, put that into the bank, By the time you hit 65, the total amount that you have, the majority of it will be the compounded interest. They'll be much larger than the actual set aside of your salary. Well, today, effectively, we have zero interest rates. Again, notwithstanding what they did yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
How are you supposed to save for retirement on zero interest rates?
Right.
Likewise, suppose you actually get to retirement and you have X amount of dollars set aside. How are you supposed to live on the interest when there is no interest?
Mm-hmm.
This is incredibly perverse. It causes people to turn to speculation, which isn't going to work out for most of them at the end of the day. And so it's a process of, instead of, I use the analogy, imagine you own a farm. Instead of operating the farm to produce a crop yield, it's trained people to think it's normal to auction off little bits of the farm. Sell off that old barn because people are using old farm, barn wood as flooring for high-end homes. Sell off the back 40 for housing development. Chop down the apple orchard and use it to make cabinets because cabinets made out of fruit wood are really cool. And so we're just liquidating everything in the economy, and we're living off of the consumption of capital that was accumulated over centuries. And people right now feel things are going pretty good. That's because the capital is still lasting out. What do you do when you get to the end of that? That would be the theme of my statement as a global economy address.
All right. Well, that's very detailed right there. Now let's get into the Gold Standard Institute. How did that whole organization come together? You founded it a couple years back. How did you get into Gold Standard and just educating people on the subject of monetary history in general? How did you get there?
So first of all, there is something called the Gold Standard Institute internationally that was founded by Philip Barton, and he and I were talking, and I said, I think there really needs to be one focused in the U.S. I think the U.S. market's a bit different; it needs a different message, and so forth. So as I started to think about it, I put together the business plan. I realized that the biggest threat to the gold standard is the argument that's been made to support the gold standard for the last 40 years. You ready? You're sitting there and one day the argument, we need the gold standard because inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the argument. That's it. Because prices are rising. And if you look at that, first of all, people didn't respond to that argument in the late 1970s when prices were truly skyrocketing. I think the official CPI in 1979 was 13%, Consumer Price Index. The reality was probably a lot higher than that. To me, as a 12-year-old boy in 1979, it certainly felt like every week, every price of everything in the grocery store was up significantly. And secondly, the gold standard in 1979 was still recent memory. They were talking about it in 1979 the way we talk about George Bush. This is current events, not ancient history. Today, gold standard is ancient history, and prices aren't skyrocketing. In fact, if you look at the commodities world, prices are in free fall. I mean, a total train wreck, losses of more than 50% to maybe 70, 75% in some cases. So it's not economically correct to say that prices are skyrocketing. People care about rising prices, but not that much. It's the sort of thing that when you get together at the bar with your buddies, you sort of complain about rising prices, and then the game comes on and everybody forgets about it. That's the level of significance to rising prices. Now, if you talk about zero interest rates, it's like what are you supposed to do? If you talk about the pressures on labor, that we have this constant, endless liquidation of labor and the compression of wages. Well, that's something people care about. You say, well, how are you supposed to save for retirement with zero interest? People care about that. How are you supposed to live in retirement on zero interest?
Right.
These are the things I think people care about. These are the things that I think politically could be winners. And then finally, I think there's just a lot of outrage about bailouts for bankers. And we have to explain that it's the nature of the system to be insolvent. It's the nature of the system that they need these bailouts periodically. And why? Because we define the government bond as the risk-free asset. How did it work out for the folks in Cyprus?
Right.
Well, the Cyprus banks bought Greek government bonds. That was the thing to do. That's what modern monetary theory, modern portfolio theory tells them to do. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, exactly what the regulators told them to do. And then the Greek government borrowed it. They called it borrowing, but it really should be called counterfeiting, because what they did was they spent it on welfare and on consumption with no means or intent to ever repay it.
Yeah.
And so the Greek government defaulted on their bonds, and now the Cyprus banks were left in the lurch because that was their asset. Now their asset collapses, but they still have the liability, which is what they owe to the depositors. So the depositors took dreadful losses. That is what is coming worldwide. And the only real choice is who takes the losses.
Right.
Does the government bail out the bank, and then government and therefore the taxpayers take the losses, or do you just say the depositors take the losses? But either way, dreadful losses are coming, and they're coming to a very large number of people. That is the nature of this system. And one by one, we're going to see it happen in country after country after country. It's coming to the U.S. last.
Right.
Not first, not next, but last, but it is coming.
All right, and so last more so because of the status of the dollar as a global reserve currency, or why would you say last?
Yeah, the dollar is the reserve currency, which means it's on both sides of every balance sheet in the world. And so one by one, we're seeing it in China now. Much ado has been made that China's currency is now part of the so-called SDR, basket at the International Monetary Fund. And yet, relentlessly, every day, the Chinese yuan is going down. Why? Because every person of any pretense of wealth in China is trying to sell yuan and buy dollars. Dollars are more liquid. Dollars are more preferred worldwide. Although China has set up bilateral trade agreements, if China buys certain things from Australia, maybe they'll pay in yuan. But I'll guarantee you one thing: if India buys something from Turkey, they're not paying in yuan, and Turkey's not interested in receiving yuan. It is dollars.
Right.
It always has been dollars. It's always going to be dollars. There's no other paper currency that can replace the dollar. There's only one thing that can, and it's a four-letter word referring to a yellow, shiny, heavy metal.
Right. All right. So speaking of gold, let's go ahead and so the overall concept of the gold standard. Millennials and centennials, the younger generation nowadays, have no awareness for the most part of the standard of gold. In our monetary system in years past. How important is it for the younger generation to begin coming and getting informed on this type of information?
Well, so they're the ones. I'll frame it in these terms.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the dollar is an irredeemable paper credit, right? So we call it the dollar bill. Bill is an archaic old word that means credit. If you take a look at a dollar bill, it doesn't say bill on it. What does it say? It says note. Note is another word for credit.
Right.
So it's a credit. It's the Federal Reserve credit. So first of all, when we pay a debt, we pay it using an IOU, which doesn't actually extinguish the debt. It doesn't make the debt go out of existence. It simply shifts it. If you go to a restaurant, you owe $100, you take out a $100 bill, you're out of the debt loop, but the debt doesn't go away. Now the Fed owes the restaurant the money. And so what is the restaurant going to do the next morning? They deposit it at the bank. Mm-hmm. Now the bank owes the restaurant and the Fed owes the bank. What is the bank going to do? Well, by its business model and by regulation, the bank's going to buy a treasury bond. Now the treasury owes the bank the money to the bank. So all we do is we keep shifting this lump under the rug. And because there's interest on all this debt, then the total debt has to rise by at least the accumulated interest for that year. Otherwise, somebody's going to be squeezed to default, which is really bad. Right. And so the total debt is rising and rising exponentially, to use the term from the computer software world, which is where I come from originally. That's not a bug, it's a feature. That's necessarily how the system is designed. Mm-hmm. And so the total debt is rising to astronomical levels. It wasn't too many years ago when Bush's $400 billion a year deficit was considered to be outrageous. And now we're running something closer to $1 trillion. And much, much, much higher numbers, by the way, if the government used the same honest accounting standard that it requires any business to use. If you have a business of $5 million or greater in revenue, you have to use accrual accounting. And on the accrual basis, the government's debt is not 18 point something trillion. It's well over 100 trillion. Who knows? I've seen numbers as high as 250 trillion. The total amount of this is ludicrous. Mm-hmm. So if you're a younger person, you're staring this at the face and say, this is going to collapse in your lifetime. I talk to people in their 70s, and some of them, perhaps rightfully, basically say, well, it's not going to be my problem. I've lived a pretty full life. It's not going to collapse tomorrow. Chances are I'm going to kick off before this really collapses. But if you're 25, you don't really have that luxury. Right. It's definitely going to happen. And so you need to understand the nature of this and hopefully become an advocate for honest money.
Hope you're enjoying this conversation with Keith Weiner thus far. Wanted to take a quick second to direct my Android users to the Rethinking the Dollar app at the Google Play Store. It'd be a good way to keep in touch with RTD interviews as well as monetary news updates. Enjoy the rest of this conversation.
let's get into some of the different standards of gold. Like there's been the classic gold standard, a gold bullion standard, and a gold exchange standard. Can you explain a little bit of those for us and how
Yeah,
those
let
have
me talk
occurred?
about what they were and then what I advocate for,
Hmm.
because the word gold standard can mean sort of any or all of those things, or mix and match.
Right.
One from column A and two from column B, like a restaurant menu.
Right.
So once upon a time, there was a gold coin standard, um, which now some people refer to as the classical gold standard. And in the gold coin standard, you have the right, but not the obligation, to own and have the gold coin literally in your pocket or literally under the mattress.
Hmm.
You could deposit it in a bank if you choose, and you would only do so if you thought that the risk and the return, i.e. the interest rate, was sufficient to make you want to give up your gold coin. And so there's a balance between taking the gold coin home and depositing it. That balance is it's one of the major factors in the interest rate. As the world raced towards World War I, they wanted to emphasize irredeemable currency, or at least make it harder to redeem. And so in World War I, and certainly in the aftermath of World War I, Britain, for example, went to a gold bullion standard, where now, so previous to that, if you had a bank deposit represented a deposit of what? Of money, of gold.
Hmm.
So you could redeem that deposit on demand. You just went up and said, here's my passbook. I have this many ounces of gold, or this many pounds, or this many dollars that represents X amount of gold. I want to withdraw it. And they had to give you the money, the gold, without question asked. The gold bullion standard said, well, now we're not going to have coins, in the banking system. We're going to have these massive 400-ounce bars, right? So 400-ounce bar at today's prices is well over $400,000. It has always had an enormous monetary value, way beyond the means of the average person.
Right.
So what they've effectively done is they said, okay, look, if you're the average person, even if you're affluent, even if you're reasonably well-to-do, who today is in a position to withdraw $400 and something thousand in one withdrawal? So it really only becomes a means for banks to reconcile trade between themselves, and for central banks, but they've really disenfranchised, is the word I use, taken away, democratized money, and taken the average person and said, you no longer matter, you no longer have a choice, your preferences don't count. And so that was a major step away from the virtues of the gold standard into something else. Subsequent to World War II, the entire world signed an insane treaty at Bretton Woods, agreeing to treat the US dollar as if it were gold. Well, the US dollar was gold redeemable to foreign central banks, not to American citizens. It was illegal, as in go to prison, to possess gold the way it is to possess cocaine today. If you're caught with it, you can go to prison. But to foreign central banks, the dollar in 1944, when the treaty was signed, was still redeemable. So they said, well, we'll treat the dollar as if it were gold, which is a false pretense going in. So that becomes the gold exchange standard. All of the other currencies have a fixed exchange ratio with the dollar, which has a fixed exchange ratio with gold. And it wasn't even 30 years, 1944 to 1971, that system collapsed. And there were economists that were able to see that it was collapsing, going to collapse, such as Robert Triffin, Jacques Rueff. There were folks way, way back that could see the whole thing was unstable, necessarily had to collapse. And so it did. And then today, post 1971, the entire world is on an irredeemable currency basis.
All right. Now let's talk about storage of value. Since the Federal Reserve, being founded in 1913 to today, apparently 96, 97% of the purchasing power of the Federal Reserve note, it has been, diminished. And so gold itself has always had value within itself. Can you talk about the purchasing power of gold as well as the Federal Reserve note?
So I have a slightly different view than most of the gold community, and I measure the decline of value in the dollar in terms of gold directly, not in terms of consumer prices or purchasing power, and I'll explain why in a moment. So the Fed is created in 1913, and at that time, the dollar was worth 1,500 milligrams of gold, 1.5 grams, a little bit over. Today, it's worth based on today's price action, I'm going to guess about 29 milligrams. So we go from 1,500 to, let's call it 30. What is that? About a 50 times loss. So we've lost about 98% in gold terms. Now, in terms of the ability to buy consumer goods, well, some consumer goods are vastly cheaper today and some are not. But at the end of the day, every productive enterprise, from farming to mining to manufacturing to distribution to retailing, is relentlessly cutting costs, relentlessly becoming more efficient. I wrote an article in Forbes just talking about milk, and we get more cows per acre, we get more cows per farmhand, of labor, we get more milk per cow, less processing of the milk, less processing of the cows, and so forth. And finally, today we put milk in incredibly cheap plastic jugs, and people buy it at a retail store. Back when my comparison point in the 1960s, a lot of people got milk in glass jars that were hand delivered by the milkman. And so we've taken an enormous amount of cost out of the equation. Priced in gold terms, the price of milk collapses. It's down 90%, something like that. In paper dollar terms, it's up whatever percentage since 1965. So prices are not fixed or static in gold. It's logical they should be falling, and falling pretty significantly because industry is becoming significantly better. We have better breeds of cows, and we have more things we put in their feed. I read all sorts of stories about how they have computer, so that each cow gets a little tag on its ear. There's a little RFID thing on it. And they train the cows to come into the barn to get milked automatically. They don't have to have labor, round the cows up. And then they give the cow a treat every time it comes into the barn to get milked. But they know if the cow's been in the barn too recently, it's just coming back for an extra treat, then it's like an automatic door system. They shunt that cow back out into the pasture. It doesn't get to, so the cow's supposed to come back every 3 or 4 hours, not every, 10 minutes.
Wow.
So all these things, it's all automated, it's all computer controlled. They measure that not only the quantity of milk output, but also the milk solids, which is really where the value is in the milk. And then they adjust the hormones, they adjust the proteins and nutritional supplements, they adjust all the stuff in the feed to keep that cow producing optimally. And in 1965, obviously, we did very little of that.
Yeah.
And so costs are coming way down. And so purchasing power, if the money had objective value, purchasing power should be rising, constantly. And so I like to use the analogy. I talk to people that talk about they talk about sound money. And sound money is defined as zero inflation. I say, okay, there's this famous Norman Rockwell painting where the butcher has a piece of meat on this scale, right? And there's like this wrapping paper sort of half sticking up from where the meat is sitting on the paper.
Yeah.
And the butcher has his finger pushing down on the scale to cheat, right, to make it weigh more than it does. But the woman who's buying it has her finger under the scale on the other side. So I said, does his cheating plus her cheating cancel out? And would you call that sound measurement or a sound scale? So imagine if every company from Intel to ConAgra to Ford was relentlessly cutting costs at the rate of 4% a year. And somehow, if it were possible, and it isn't, for the central planners who manage our dollar to relentlessly debase the dollar at exactly the same 4% per year. So the net result of monetary looting plus corporate process improvements, the net result was zero change in prices. Would you call that sound money? In those terms, I don't think anybody could possibly agree that's sound money.
Right.
That's at best, what they're doing is they're carefully measuring how much improvement corporations are making, and then they're debasing the currency. They're looting us of the improvements, efficiency gains that we otherwise would be getting.
Right. Now, we're talking a lot about gold here. Now, what's your thoughts on silver? Because, silver is a part of our monetary system as well. Are you in the same ballpark as far as its level of importance, or?
So classically, starting with the Coinage Act of 1792, they made a big mistake, and they fixed the price of silver in terms of gold, or fixed the price of gold in terms of silver. And so when they did that, initially, they undervalued gold as money, and therefore gold wouldn't circulate, and effectively we're on a silver standard, 1792. And then in 1834, they reversed it, and they got it the other way, and they started driving silver out. I'm in favor of simply having a free market, simply allowing the people who want to use gold or use silver or hold it or deposit it, pay interest on it, lend it and get interest, whatever it is they want to do with it. Classically, there's a reason why we had gold and silver. Normally, in markets, you see winner take all. It's Intel. We don't have PowerPC architecture anymore. We don't have Motorola architecture anymore. We don't have digital IBM, all these different instruction sets. Computers are pretty much standardized around Intel, and then for mobile phones, it's generally ARM. Why didn't we have two? Or why did we have, classically, why did we have two kinds of money instead of one? And the answer is silver suits the small saver. If you're working for wages and you want to set aside 10% of your wage, today that might be, $20 to $50 to $60 worth of wage that you want to set aside. Gold doesn't really work. I mean, an ounce of gold is almost $1,100.
Right.
So you're talking about a tiny fraction of an ounce. It becomes very expensive, very difficult to deal with. And so silver worked because it simply offered a more economical way, less loss to get into an amount of silver of that size and then get out of it later. So silver worked historically for the small savers. I still think that's largely true today, although now today there are accounts you can have that let you own a small fraction of an ounce, like BitGold and so forth. But to hold metal in your hand, to hold $20 worth of silver in your hand is over an ounce. It has some actual heft to it.
Right.
To hold $20 worth of gold, and if you have a little flake of gold like that, it blow away in the wind if it was a foil. So I think both of them have a role.
Yeah. Now, being that you're, I guess, in the tech world, with the whole Bitcoin cryptocurrency, do you see anything positive in that as far as alternatives beyond the paper status quo?
I don't see Bitcoin as money, but I see it as the blockchain as an incredible technology that is going to revolutionize finance in probably a lot of ways because it provides an instant and indelible and provable ledger that nobody can tamper with after the fact.
Right.
So I can sign a smart contract with you. I can have my entire books on there, and then only if I give you the password can you decrypt it. But it provides a lot of features that are really good. But Bitcoin itself isn't money. Bitcoin, just like the dollar, is irredeemable. Just in bits in a database. It's not money. It's something that people speculate on, hoping and assuming that somebody will later want to buy off of them at a higher price. But the same thing I say, especially to the silver bugs, I emphasize to the Bitcoin people, do not confuse Bitcoin going up with monetary economics or monetary policy. They're not the same. Right, not the same thing at all.
Well, this concludes part one of my discussion with Keith Weiner. Hope you found this to be informative. Want to encourage you to become a Interview Extra subscriber. We get a chance to hear more of my conversation with Keith, where he discussed the current status of the dollar, as well as his thoughts on the future of the dollar. And also, I want to encourage you to visit goldstandardinstitute.us, as well as keithweinereconomics.com to see more of Keith's work. Looking forward to bringing you more interviews in the future. Stay tuned.